My name is Rachel Anderson. I'm 32 years old, and the day my father was buried should have been about saying goodbye. But instead, it became the beginning of a nightmare I never saw coming. At my father's funeral, while everyone around me cried loudly and clutched their tissues, a lawyer I'd never met before leaned in close and whispered my name like it was a secret he wasn't supposed to share. His breath was cold against my ear, his voice steady and deliberate, and in that single moment, grief turned into something much darker: fear. If you're watching this wondering how a funeral could turn into betrayal, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a like, because what I'm about to tell you will leave you speechless. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. The whisper wasn't loud, but it cut through the noise like a blade slicing through fabric. Everyone else was focused on the casket being lowered into the ground, their faces twisted in sorrow. But this man, dressed in a sharp black suit with eyes that gave nothing away, looked at me like I was a puzzle he needed to solve. He didn't say much, just 5 words that made my blood run cold. "We need to talk. Privately." My hands were shaking as I tried to process what was happening, my heart pounding so hard I thought everyone could hear it. I nodded slowly, unable to speak, and watched as he stepped back into the crowd like a ghost disappearing into fog. I stood there frozen, surrounded by people who were supposed to be my family, but suddenly I felt like a stranger in my own life. The flowers smelled too strong, almost suffocating, and the sound of dirt hitting the coffin echoed in my chest like a drum. Something was wrong, deeply, terribly wrong. That lawyer's voice kept replaying in my mind, calm but heavy with meaning, and I knew right then that my father's death wasn't just an ending. It was the beginning of something far worse, and I was standing at the edge of a truth I wasn't ready to face. My father's death was supposed to end years of silence, tension, and walking on eggshells around a man who never learned how to show love without conditions. For as long as I could remember, he ruled our house with an iron fist wrapped in politeness. His anger was never loud, but it was always there, simmering beneath every conversation, every decision, every moment. I thought that when he died, I'd finally be free to breathe, to live without feeling like I was constantly being judged or measured against some invisible standard I could never reach. But standing there at his funeral, listening to people talk about what a great man he was, I realized something chilling. Even in death, he had found a way to control me. The lawyer's warning kept circling my mind like a vulture. What did he mean by, "We need to talk"? What could possibly be so urgent that it couldn't wait until after the burial, after the prayers, after I'd had even a single moment to process the fact that my father was gone? I scanned the crowd, searching for answers in the faces around me. My mother stood stiff and distant, her eyes glazed over like she was somewhere else entirely. My older brother, Marcus, was shaking hands and accepting condolences with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. My Aunt Patricia whispered something to my cousin, and they both glanced at me before quickly looking away. Everyone seemed to be playing a role, reciting lines they'd practiced, and I was the only one who didn't have a script. That's when it hit me. This funeral wasn't about mourning. It was about power. It was about secrets buried deeper than the coffin they were lowering into the ground. My father had spent his entire life controlling every detail, every conversation, every outcome, and now, even from the grave, he was pulling strings I couldn't see yet. I felt a chill run down my spine despite the summer heat, and my stomach twisted with a mix of dread and anger. Whatever was coming, whatever that lawyer wanted to tell me, I knew one thing for certain. My father's death wasn't an ending. It was a trap, and I had just walked right into it. Growing up in the Anderson household felt like living in a museum. Everything looked perfect on the outside, but you weren't allowed to touch anything, feel anything, or be anything other than what was expected of you. My father, Thomas Anderson, was a successful real estate developer who built his empire on control and precision, and he ran our family the same way he ran his business, with rules, expectations, and consequences that were never spoken but always understood. Love wasn't something you felt in our home, it was something you earned, and only if you played by his rules. My mother, Helen, learned early on to stay quiet and compliant, nodding along to whatever he decided, her voice fading over the years until she became almost invisible. I grew up watching her disappear, and I promised myself I'd never let that happen to me. But here I was, standing at his funeral, realizing I'd been disappearing too. My brother Marcus was the golden child, the one who could do no wrong in my father's eyes. He followed every instruction, pursued the career path my father laid out for him, married the woman my father approved of, and never once questioned the system. If you're feeling this tension and wondering where this is going, make sure you're subscribed and hit that like button, because the betrayal I'm about to uncover will shock you as much as it shocked me. Marcus and I used to be close when we were kids, but as we grew older, something shifted. He became distant, calculating, always watching me like I was a problem he needed to manage. My father praised him constantly, held him up as the example I should follow, and slowly, I watched my brother transform into a younger version of the man who controlled us both. Even in mourning, surrounded by relatives and family friends, I didn't feel safe. Aunt Patricia, my father's sister, had always treated me with a cold politeness that made my skin crawl. Her hugs were stiff, her compliments backhanded. Her presence always felt like surveillance. My cousin Derek stood next to her, arms crossed, watching me with the same calculating expression Marcus wore. No one asked how I was doing, no one acknowledged my pain, and no one seemed to care that I'd just lost my father. Instead, they whispered to each other, glanced in my direction, and avoided direct eye contact like I was contagious. The silence in that room was louder than any words could have been, and I realized something terrifying. I wasn't part of this family. I was the outsider they'd been waiting to eliminate. As the priest continued his prayers and the mourners bowed their heads in supposed reverence, I found myself scanning the crowd, trying to understand the strange energy that hung in the air like smoke. There were people there I'd never seen before, men in expensive suits standing at the back, not crying, not praying, just observing. One of them caught my eye, an older man with silver hair and a face carved from stone, and when our eyes met, he didn't look away or offer a sympathetic nod. He just stared, cold and assessing, like he was measuring me for something I didn't understand yet. My stomach churned with unease, and I turned back toward the casket, but the feeling of being watched never left. Marcus stood on the other side of the grave, his face a mask of appropriate grief, but I knew my brother well enough to see through it. His jaw was too tight, his hands clenched too hard, and every few minutes, he'd glance at his phone like he was expecting an important message. Aunt Patricia kept whispering to him, her hand on his arm, and whatever she was saying made his expression harden even more. They weren't mourning, they were strategizing. I could feel it in my bones, that sick twist of intuition that tells you something is wrong even when you can't name it yet. The entire funeral felt choreographed, like a play where everyone knew their lines except me, and I was the only one who didn't realize I was the villain in their story. Then I saw him again, the lawyer who had whispered my name. He was standing near a black car parked just beyond the cemetery gates, talking on his phone, his eyes occasionally flicking toward me. He wasn't part of the ceremony, wasn't offering condolences or paying respects. He was waiting for the performance to end, waiting for the crowd to disperse, waiting for the moment when he could pull me aside and tell me whatever truth my family was so desperate to hide. That's when I understood something that made my blood run cold. These people weren't here to say goodbye to my father. They were here to make sure something happened exactly the way it was supposed to, and I was the variable they needed to control. The funeral ended with the final prayer, and people began to scatter like leaves in the wind, some heading to their cars, others lingering in small groups to exchange pleasantries and make plans for the reception at my mother's house. I felt a hand on my shoulder and turned to find the lawyer standing there, his expression unreadable, but his presence urgent. "Miss Anderson," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm Edward Brennan. I was your father's attorney for the last 6 months of his life, and there are things you need to know before you walk into that house with your family." His words hit me like ice water, and suddenly the warm afternoon felt arctic. Before I could respond, he gestured toward his car, and something in his eyes, a mix of concern and warning, made me follow him without question. We stood beside his vehicle, away from the crowd, and Edward pulled out a thin manila folder from his briefcase. His hands were steady, but his voice carried the weight of someone delivering news he wished he didn't have to share. "Your father came to me 3 weeks before he died. he began, his eyes scanning the area to make sure no one was listening. He was concerned about certain financial transactions that had been made in his name, documents he didn't remember signing, decisions about his estate that he never authorized. He suspected someone close to him was preparing for his death before it happened, and he wanted me to investigate. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt the ground shift beneath my feet. My father had known something was wrong, had felt the betrayal circling him like sharks in dark water, and he'd reached out for help. But it came too late. Edward's voice dropped even lower, and he leaned in slightly, his words measured and deliberate. "Rachel, your father's death was ruled natural causes, heart failure, but the timing of everything else raises questions I can't ignore. Bank accounts were emptied days before he passed, property deeds were transferred, beneficiaries on his life insurance were changed without his knowledge. Someone had access to his documents, his signatures, his entire financial life, and they moved fast." He paused, letting that sink in, and then added the words that would haunt me for weeks. "Trust no one who shares your blood. Your father's last words to me were, 'Protect Rachel. She doesn't know what's coming.'" My hands started trembling. My vision blurred with tears I refused to let fall, and I realized that my father, the man I thought controlled everything, had died trying to warn me about the people I was supposed to call family. The reception at my mother's house was exactly what I expected. Polite conversation, catered food no one really ate, and a suffocating atmosphere of forced sympathy. I walked through the front door and felt like I was stepping into a performance where everyone had rehearsed except me. People offered their condolences with practiced smiles, their voices soft and appropriate, but no one actually looked at me. Not really. They looked through me, past me, around me, like I was a ghost haunting my own father's wake. My mother sat in the living room surrounded by relatives, accepting hugs and kind words, but when I approached, she barely acknowledged me, just patted my hand once and turned back to Aunt Patricia. That small gesture, or lack of it, cut deeper than any words could have. I moved through the rooms like a stranger, watching my family interact with each other. Marcus laughing quietly with Derek, Aunt Patricia whispering intensely with my mother, cousins I barely knew making themselves comfortable in a house that suddenly felt foreign to me. If you've ever felt invisible in a room full of people who are supposed to love you, hit that subscribe button and drop a like, because what I discovered next will validate every instinct you've ever had about betrayal. No one asked how I was holding up. No one pulled me aside to share a memory of my father. No one offered the kind of comfort you're supposed to give someone who just buried their parent. Instead, I felt like an intruder, like my presence was inconvenient, something they had to tolerate until they could get on with whatever they were really planning. I found myself standing alone in the hallway outside my father's study, staring at the closed door and remembering all the times I'd been forbidden from entering that room without permission. Even now, with him gone, I hesitated before turning the handle, half expecting to hear his voice telling me to leave, to mind my own business, to stop asking questions. But the room was silent and empty, filled with the scent of old leather and expensive cologne. His desk neat and organized just the way he always kept it. I sat in his chair and felt the weight of everything Edward had told me pressing down on my chest like a stone. My father had died alone, surrounded by people who smiled to his face while plotting behind his back. And now I was living the same nightmare, mourning alone in a crowded room, surrounded by enemies wearing the masks of family. The days following the funeral blurred together into a haze of uncomfortable silences and strategic conversations that always seemed to stop the moment I entered a room. My mother asked me to stay at the house to help with arrangements, but I quickly realized I wasn't there to help. I was there to be managed. Every time I tried to ask questions about my father's affairs, about his will, about the things Edward had mentioned, someone would redirect the conversation with practiced ease. "Now isn't the time, Rachel," my mother would say softly, her eyes filled with what looked like sadness but felt like warning. "You're too emotional right now. Let us handle the difficult things. You just focus on healing." They used my grief like a leash, tugging me back every time I got too close to the truth, reminding me that good daughters don't ask questions, don't make waves, don't disrespect their father's memory by doubting the family. Marcus was the worst of them all. He'd pull me aside with that concerned older brother expression, his hand on my shoulder, his voice dripping with false compassion. "I know this is hard, Rach," he'd say, using the childhood nickname he hadn't called me in years. "But you have to trust that Dad knew what he was doing. He made arrangements, he took care of everything, and all we have to do is follow his wishes. You questioning everything just makes this harder on Mom." But I noticed things he didn't think I'd see. The way his eyes would dart to Aunt Patricia for confirmation before he spoke. The way he'd change the subject whenever I mentioned Edward Brennan. The way his jaw would tighten when I asked about specific bank accounts or property transfers. He wasn't comforting me. He was containing me, making sure I stayed quiet and compliant, just like our mother had learned to do years ago. Aunt Patricia was more direct in her manipulation. She cornered me in the kitchen one afternoon, her smile sharp as broken glass, and said, "Your father wouldn't want you stirring up trouble, Rachel. He spent his whole life building this family's reputation, and the last thing he'd want is his daughter tearing it apart because she's too grief-stricken to think clearly. Sometimes love means letting go of control and trusting the people who've always had your best interests at heart." Her words were poison wrapped in silk, and I felt my hands clench into fists at my sides. She was telling me to disappear, to stay small, to let them erase me from the equation without a fight. That's when I understood their strategy perfectly. They weren't going to threaten me or force me into anything. They were going to use my pain, my grief, my supposed emotional instability as the reason I couldn't be trusted with the truth. And if I broke, if I cried, if I showed any weakness, it would only prove their point. For years, I had survived in the Anderson family by staying quiet, by making myself small, by learning to read the room and adjust my behavior accordingly. It was a skill I'd developed as a child, watching my mother shrink herself to fit my father's expectations, and I'd perfected it as an adult, choosing silence over conflict every single time. But something shifted inside me the day after Aunt Patricia's kitchen conversation. I woke up in my childhood bedroom, stared at the ceiling, and realized that staying silent was exactly what they wanted, what they needed, in order to get away with whatever they were planning. My father had tried to warn me, had hired Edward Brennan to protect me, and if I let them bully me into obedience, then his last act of love would be meaningless. I started paying attention in ways I never had before. I stopped leaving rooms when conversations got tense, stopped accepting vague answers to direct questions, stopped pretending I didn't notice the meaningful glances exchanged between Marcus and my mother. When Marcus told me the will reading would be handled privately to avoid unnecessary stress, I looked him straight in the eye and said, "I'll be there, with my own attorney if necessary." The room went silent, and I watched shock register on his face before he quickly masked it with that practiced concern. "That's not necessary, Rachel," he said slowly, like he was talking to a child. "We're family. We don't need lawyers fighting each other." But I held his gaze and replied, "Then there's nothing to worry about, is there?" It was the first time I'd ever challenged him directly, and the shift in the air was immediate and electric. That night, I called Edward Brennan from my car, parked 2 blocks away from the house where I knew no one could overhear. His voice was steady when he answered, and I could hear the relief in it when I told him I was ready to know everything. "Your father kept detailed records," he said. "Bank statements, emails, recordings of conversations he had with your brother and your aunt in the weeks before he died. He knew they were planning something, and he documented every step." "Rachel, what they've done isn't just morally wrong, it's criminal. But proving it means you're going to have to be strong, stronger than you've ever been, because they're not going to give up without a fight." I sat in the darkness of my car, my heart pounding, and felt something ignite in my chest. Not anger exactly, but something sharper and more focused. For the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of my family. I was ready to fight back. Edward Brennan's office was nothing like I expected. Small, cluttered with case files, and smelling faintly of coffee that had been sitting too long. He cleared a chair for me and spread documents across his desk like pieces of a puzzle he'd been trying to solve for months. "Your father came to me because he noticed discrepancies," Edward began, pointing to highlighted sections of bank statements. "Over the course of 6 months, nearly $200,000 was withdrawn from his personal accounts, in increments small enough not to trigger automatic alerts. Property deeds for 2 rental homes he owned were transferred to your brother's name, and the beneficiary on his life insurance policy, originally you, was changed to your mother, with your brother listed as secondary. My stomach dropped as I stared at the papers, my father's forged signature staring back at me from document after document. This wasn't just betrayal. This was systematic theft, planned and executed while my father was still alive. But the worst part, the part that made my blood run cold, was what Edward showed me next. A series of emails between Marcus and Aunt Patricia discussing my father's declining health and how to expedite the transition of assets before Rachel starts asking questions. If this is making your blood boil like mine did, make sure you're subscribed and hit that like button, because the revenge I eventually got is something you won't want to miss. One email, dated just 2 weeks before my father's death, read, "Thomas is getting suspicious. We need to move faster. Patricia, can you talk to Helen about keeping Rachel distracted? The last thing we need is her getting involved and complicating everything." They had talked about me like I was an obstacle, a problem to be managed and removed, and my own mother had been complicit in keeping me in the dark. Edward leaned back in his chair and looked at me with an expression that mixed sympathy and determination. "Your father recorded his last conversation with Marcus," he said quietly, pulling out a small digital recorder from his desk drawer. "He confronted your brother 3 days before he died, asked him directly about the missing money and the changed documents. I'm going to play it for you, but I need you to be prepared. It's not easy to hear." He pressed play, and my father's voice filled the room, weak but angry. "You think I'm a fool, Marcus? You think I don't see what you're doing?" And then my brother's voice, cold and dismissive. "You're paranoid, Dad. Maybe it's time to consider that your mind isn't what it used to be. Sign the papers, let me handle things, and everyone will be better off." The recording continued for 3 more minutes, my father pleading, my brother gaslighting him into silence. And when it ended, I sat there with tears streaming down my face, realizing my father had died, knowing his own son had betrayed him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The drive back to my mother's house felt longer than it ever had before. Every mile weighted with the knowledge I now carried. I had evidence, concrete, undeniable proof that my brother and aunt had stolen from my father, manipulated him in his final days, and erased me from his will through fraud and forgery. Edward had laid out my options clearly. I could take everything to the police and pursue criminal charges, which would be public, messy, and would destroy what was left of my family. Or I could use the evidence as leverage in a civil case, recover what was rightfully mine, and walk away quietly. "Either way," he'd said, "you're going to lose people. The question is whether you can live with staying silent, or whether the truth matters more than the family you thought you had." I sat in my car outside the house, watching through the windows as Marcus and my mother talked in the kitchen, their faces relaxed and comfortable, completely unaware that I knew everything. Part of me wanted to walk in there and confront them immediately, to throw the evidence on the table and watch their faces crumble when they realized they'd been caught. But another part of me, the part that had learned to survive by being strategic, knew that rushing in angry would only give them time to regroup, to create counter-narratives, to paint me as the unstable daughter who couldn't handle grief and was lashing out at innocent family members. If I was going to do this, I needed to be smart, calculated, and absolutely certain I was ready for the fallout. That night, I barely slept. I kept replaying my father's recorded voice in my head, hearing the pain and betrayal in every word, and I thought about all the years I'd spent trying to earn his approval, trying to fit into a family that never really wanted me as anything other than compliant and convenient. If I spoke up, if I exposed what Marcus and Aunt Patricia had done, I would lose my mother. She would choose my brother over me, just like she always had. I would lose cousins, family friends, the entire network of people I'd grown up around. But if I stayed silent, if I let them get away with it just to keep the peace, I would lose something far more important. I would lose myself. And sitting there in the darkness, I realized that I'd already been losing myself for years, piece by piece, every time I chose silence over truth. This was my chance to stop disappearing, and I wasn't going to waste it. The will reading was scheduled for exactly 2 weeks after the funeral, held in a conference room at the law firm that had handled my father's estate for decades. I arrived early with Edward Brennan by my side, and the moment Marcus saw me walk in with an attorney, his entire demeanor shifted. The concerned brother act vanished instantly, replaced by something cold and calculating that I'd seen glimpses of, but never fully recognized until now. "What's this about, Rachel?" he asked, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "Why do you need a lawyer at a family meeting?" I met his eyes without flinching and said simply, "Because this stopped being about family the moment you decided to steal from our father." The room went silent. My mother's face drained of color, and Aunt Patricia's expression twisted into something ugly and defensive. What followed was 3 hours of the most brutal, soul-crushing confrontation I'd ever experienced. Edward presented the evidence methodically: bank statements, forged documents, email exchanges, and finally, the recording of my father's last conversation with Marcus. I watched my brother's face cycle through denial, anger, and finally a chilling composure as he realized there was no way to lie his way out of this. But instead of apologizing, instead of showing even a shred of remorse, he turned the attack on me. "You're really going to destroy this family over money?" he said, his voice dripping with disgust. "Dad would be ashamed of you, Rachel. He spent his whole life building something, and you're tearing it apart because you're bitter and jealous that he trusted me more than he trusted you." His words were designed to wound, to make me doubt myself, to trigger all those years of conditioning that told me to stay small and quiet. But something had fundamentally changed in me. I didn't shrink back, didn't apologize, didn't let his manipulation land the way it used to. Instead, I stood up, looked directly at my mother who had sat silent through the entire confrontation, and said, You knew what they were doing, and you helped them keep me in the dark because it was easier than standing up for what was right. Dad tried to protect me, tried to leave me something so I wouldn't be erased, and you let Marcus steal it because you've spent so long choosing him over me that you don't even see it anymore." My mother's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't deny it, didn't defend herself. She just looked away. That moment, that silence, told me everything I needed to know. I had lost my family, but the truth was, I'd never really had them to begin with. They labeled me ungrateful, emotional, unstable, vindictive, every word designed to discredit me and shift blame. But for the first time in my life, their words didn't touch me. I knew the truth, and that was enough. The legal battle that followed was brutal and exhausting, stretching over 8 months of depositions, court filings, and negotiations. Marcus fought back with everything he had, hiring expensive attorneys who tried to paint me as a mentally unstable daughter who was fabricating evidence out of grief and resentment. My mother refused to speak to me, and the extended family closed ranks, choosing sides in a war I never wanted but refused to lose. There were nights when I questioned everything, when the loneliness felt unbearable, when I wondered if the truth was worth the price I was paying, when I almost picked up the phone to call Marcus and offer a compromise just to make the pain stop. But every time I came close to giving up, I would listen to that recording again, hear my father's voice, and remember why I was fighting. Edward became not just my attorney, but my anchor through the chaos. He walked me through every step, prepared me for every attack, and reminded me constantly that fear was a tool they were using to control me, and I didn't have to let it work anymore. "They want you to be afraid," he told me one afternoon, after a particularly vicious deposition where Marcus's lawyer had tried to tear apart my character. "They want you to feel isolated and overwhelmed so you'll give up and go away quietly. But you're not that person anymore, Rachel. You stopped being that person the moment you walked into my office and chose truth over comfort." His words became a mantra I repeated to myself whenever doubt crept in. And slowly, something remarkable happened. The fear that had controlled me my entire life began to transform into something sharper and more powerful: clarity. I stopped asking for permission to exist, stopped apologizing for taking up space, stopped trying to make myself palatable to people who had never truly seen me as anything other than an inconvenience. I learned to trust my own voice, my own instincts, my own sense of what was right and wrong without needing external validation. For the first time in 32 years, I understood what it felt like to be free. not from consequences or difficulty, but from the prison of other people's expectations. The loneliness was real, the pain was real, but so was the strength I discovered buried beneath years of conditioning. I had spent my whole life being afraid of what would happen if I stood up for myself, and now that I was finally doing it, I realized the fear had always been worse than the reality. The day the judge ruled in my favor felt surreal, like waking up from a nightmare only to realize the world had completely changed while you were asleep. The court found overwhelming evidence of fraud, forgery, and financial elder abuse, and Marcus was ordered to return every stolen dollar, relinquish the properties he'd illegally transferred, and pay substantial legal fees and damages. The judge's words were sharp and unforgiving. The evidence presented shows a calculated, systematic theft from a vulnerable man in the final months of his life, perpetrated by those he should have been able to trust most, his own family. This court finds such actions reprehensible and will not allow them to stand. I sat there listening, Edward's hand briefly touching my shoulder in quiet support, and I felt something break open inside me. Not grief, not anger, but a profound sense of vindication that I hadn't known I needed until that very moment. Marcus didn't look at me as we left the courtroom. His face was stone, his jaw clenched so tight I thought it might shatter, and for a brief second, I felt a flicker of something that might have been sadness for the brother I thought I'd had. But that person had never really existed. My mother stood beside him, her arm linked through his, and when I tried to make eye contact one last time, she turned her face away as if I were a stranger on the street. Aunt Patricia glared at me with pure hatred, and I heard her mutter something under her breath about me being just like my father, stubborn and cruel. The irony wasn't lost on me. They had stolen, lied, manipulated, and gaslit a dying man, but somehow I was the villain for refusing to let them get away with it. That moment crystallized everything I'd learned over the past months. Some people will never take responsibility for their actions, and seeking their approval or understanding is a waste of precious life. Walking out of that courthouse, I felt the weight of years lifting off my shoulders. I had lost my family. There was no sugarcoating that truth, but I had gained something infinitely more valuable, myself. I wasn't the scared, compliant girl who had walked into my father's funeral months ago, the one who second-guessed every instinct and apologized for existing. I was someone who had stared down fear, stood alone against people who tried to erase her, and refused to disappear just because it would have been easier for everyone else. Some doors had closed forever that day, doors I had once desperately wanted to keep open, but in losing those relationships, I discovered something my father had tried to teach me in his final act. The people who truly matter will stand by you when it costs them something. Everyone else is just performing for an audience that will eventually turn on them too. 3 months after the court ruling, I received a package from Edward's office. Inside was a letter my father had written and left in Edward's care with instructions to deliver it only after everything was settled. My hands shook as I unfolded the paper, and I could see his handwriting, shaky but determined, filling the page. "Rachel," it began, "if you're reading this, it means you fought back. It means you didn't let them silence you the way I let them silence me for too many years. I'm sorry I wasn't strong enough to protect you while I was alive. Sorry I created a family dynamic where love was conditional and control was confused with care. But I'm proud of you for being braver than I ever was. The money, the properties, none of that matters. What matters is that you learned the most important lesson I failed to teach you while I had the chance. Your voice, your truth, your refusal to disappear. That's the real inheritance. Don't waste it trying to win back people who never valued you in the first place. Build something new. Be free. Love, Dad." I sat on my apartment floor, the small place I'd moved into after leaving my mother's house, and cried in a way I hadn't allowed myself to cry through the entire ordeal. Not tears of sadness or loss, but tears of release, of recognition, of finally understanding what my father had been trying to tell me in those final weeks when he'd hired Edward and documented everything. He hadn't just been protecting my financial inheritance. He'd been giving me permission to break free from the family system that had suffocated us both. In his final act, the man who had controlled everything had given me the one thing I'd never had, the freedom to choose myself over obligation, truth over comfort, integrity over belonging. And in doing so, He'd given me the greatest gift a parent can give a child. Not money or property, but the courage to live authentically, even when it costs everything. I didn't inherit money, approval, or protection from a family that had never really been a family at all. I inherited something far more valuable and permanent. Courage forged in betrayal and loss, strength built from standing alone, and an unshakable sense of self that no one could ever take from me again. That inheritance changed everything. It changed how I moved through the world, how I chose relationships, how I measured success and fulfillment. I stopped seeking validation from people who had never been capable of giving it, stopped shrinking myself to fit into spaces that were never meant for me, and started building a life based on my own values rather than inherited expectations. And that shift, that fundamental transformation from invisible to undeniable, was worth more than any bank account or property deed could ever be. If you've ever been controlled through silence, if you've ever felt invisible in your own family, if you've ever been told that speaking your truth makes you the problem, this story is yours too. And I want you to know that you're not alone. The journey from compliance to courage isn't easy, and there were moments when I thought the loneliness would break me. But on the other side of that fear is a version of yourself you never knew existed. Stronger, clearer, and absolutely unwilling to disappear for anyone's comfort. What I discovered after the court case, after the dust settled and I started rebuilding my life from the ground up, taught me lessons about family, forgiveness, and the difference between being alone and being lonely that I wish someone had told me years ago. In the next video, I'm going to share what happened after I won, the unexpected relationships that formed, the family member who eventually reached out with an apology I never saw coming, and the moment I realized that revenge isn't about making others pay, it's about refusing to keep paying the price for their choices. Because here's what they don't tell you about standing up for yourself. Sometimes the people who hurt you never apologize, never change, never acknowledge what they did, but you heal anyway, you build anyway, you thrive anyway. And that success, that peace you create in spite of them, is the truest form of justice there is. So if this story resonated with you, if you felt that same suffocating weight of family expectations or the sting of betrayal from people who were supposed to protect you, make sure you're subscribed and notifications are turned on, because what comes next is about transformation, healing, and the unexpected ways life rewards you for choosing yourself. Drop a comment and tell me, have you ever had to choose between keeping the peace and speaking your truth? What did you choose? And would you make the same decision again? I read every single comment, and your stories matter just as much as mine. I'll see you in the next video, where the real healing begins, and trust me, you're going to want to hear this part.